Before the legends of Greece and many of the tales of the Bible, there was Gilgamesh, the world's first epic hero who lived in the lands of ancient Sumeria. Gilgamesh was a warrior of immense power. In battle, he was like a wild bull on the rampage. Leading his vanguard of warriors, he crushed all who stood before him. There was no king who could rival him, for he was 2/3 god and only 1/3 human, the son of King Lagalbanda and the goddess Ninsun. Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk with great pride. On many occasions, he would lead a person up onto the walls of the city, where he would say to them, "Climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth. Survey the foundation. Examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundation? A square mile is the city. A square mile the date grove. A square mile the clay pit. Half a square mile the temple of Ishtar. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse." However, whilst he ruled over Uruk, he also tyrannized the people there. Under his rule, when a couple were to be married, it would be Gilgamesh who would spend the first night with the bride, and not the groom. Unsurprisingly, the people of Uruk were unhappy with this, and so they prayed to Anu, the king of the gods, to aid them in putting a stop to Gilgamesh. Anu heard their prayers, and so he summoned the goddess Araru. He commanded her to create a man as follows: "Let him be a match for the storm of his heart. Let them vie with each other, so Uruk may be rested." After hearing Anu's words, the goddess Araru washed her hands, then took a pinch of clay and threw it down into the wild. There she created a man known as Enkidu. Enkidu had long hair and a long beard, which grew wild and free. He knew nothing about people or nations of the world. Instead, he lived free with the gazelles. They accepted him among their number, and with them he grazed the grasses and drank from the watering holes. One day, a hunter came upon one of these watering holes and saw Enkidu. For the 2nd and 3rd days, the hunter again saw Enkidu. The hunter was troubled and unsure what to make of this. That evening he spoke to his father, saying that he had seen a wild man of great strength and might living amongst the gazelles. He also complained Enkidu was filling the hunter's pit traps and removing his snares. The father told the young hunter that he should go to Gilgamesh in Uruk and inform him of this wild man. The hunter did just that. Arriving in Uruk, he went before Gilgamesh and spoke of a wild man, stating that he had great strength, that he grazed the grasses and lived always with the herd. Gilgamesh responded that the hunter should take a local harlot named Shamhat with him and lead her to Enkidu. Then she should seduce the wild man, and after he had contact with a woman, the herd would spurn him. The hunter found Shamhat and took her with him on his quest. Together they travelled to one of the watering holes and waited there for a couple of days until at last the herd arrived and Enkidu with them. Then, at the hunter's command, Shamhat stepped out into the open before Enkidu and undressed herself. Enkidu was taken with her beauty, and he left the herd to come over to her. Together, Enkidu and Shamhat were coupled for 6 days and 7 nights. At the end of the 7th night, Enkidu was fully sated, and he turned his gaze away from Shamhat and back towards the herd. However, when the gazelles saw Enkidu now, they turned and fled from him, for now Enkidu had defiled his once pure body. They would not accept him. He was greatly saddened by this, and so returned to Shamhat and sat on the floor beside her. Whilst he sat there, Shamhat told him of Uruk and Gilgamesh and asked him to go with her to the city. Enkidu announced that he would go there and put his strength to the test against Gilgamesh. And so they set off for Uruk, but not before spending another week in the wilderness together first. Meanwhile, in Uruk, Gilgamesh had a dream. In it, there was a great axe lying on the ground. Gilgamesh came to the axe and picked it up and loved the axe and considered it his equal. When he asked his mother about the axe, she said that the dream meant that Gilgamesh would soon have a new friend who would be his equal. Now, as Enkidu knew very little of the ways of men, Shamhat decided to stop off first at a shepherd's camp. They spent time there with the shepherds, and Enkidu worked for them. For the first time in his life, he ate bread and drank ale. At night, whilst the shepherds slept, Enkidu watched for wolves or lions in case any came near the flock. One day, though, whilst conversing with the shepherds, Enkidu learned of Gilgamesh's practice of sleeping with brides on their wedding nights, and he was enraged at the injustice. He set off for Uruk at once. Now it was the night of a wedding when he arrived in Uruk, and Gilgamesh was on his way to it. However, Enkidu blocked the door to the wedding house, standing firm. They seized each other in the doorway and fought in the street. The doors shook and the walls shuddered as the two men fought. But then Gilgamesh's anger subsided, and he broke off the fight. In the fight, the two men had developed a mutual respect for each other. Enkidu said to Gilgamesh, "High over warriors, you are exalted. To be king over the people, Enlil made it your destiny." Gilgamesh's mother told him that Enkidu had lived in the wild, so had no family. Therefore, Gilgamesh resolved to be a brother to Enkidu. He asked Enkidu to be his friend, and Enkidu agreed. Now, thought Gilgamesh, how should they celebrate this new friendship? The answer came to him immediately. By going on a quest! Now, in a place known as the Cedar Forest, there lived a powerful monster known as Humbaba. Gilgamesh proposed to Enkidu that they should set off on an adventure to slay this great monster. Now, even for a man like Enkidu, this seemed a bit much. Humbaba was a fearsome monster, and he had sighted it when he had been living in the wilderness. Enkidu spoke, saying, Humbaba, his voice is the deluge, his speech is fire, his breath is death. Gilgamesh would not be put off though, so eventually Enkidu agreed. They headed to the smiths and collected an array of axes and daggers to take with them. Then Gilgamesh announced to the people of his plans to slay Humbaba. They were shocked by this, and many of Gilgamesh's advisors warned him not to go. They told him of the danger, but Gilgamesh would not be dissuaded. When they realized that Gilgamesh would not turn from his path, the advisor went to Enkidu and asked that he ensure the king's safe return. Gilgamesh's mother, Ninsun, was also worried for her son's safety. Wearing her finest dress, she climbed to the roof of the palace and prayed to the sun god, asking him to protect and guide Gilgamesh on his quest. Then she summoned Enkidu and asked him to protect her son. Finally, she asked the sun god to protect Enkidu as well. Later, the two of them set off, leaving Gilgamesh's advisors in charge of the city. It was a vast distance to reach the Cedar Forest, and so they would walk during the day and camp in the evening. On the third day, they would perform a ritual to the gods. Gilgamesh would climb to the top of a nearby mountain and pour out some flour as an offering. Then he would ask for good dreams as a sign of his coming victory against Humbaba. Gilgamesh found the dreams he experienced following these rituals to be strange. On the first night he completed it, he dreamed that he and Enkidu were standing on a mountain slope. The mountain fell down under them, but they flew over it. When he told Enkidu of the dream, Enkidu thought it was a good omen, saying that the falling mountain was Humbaba. Gilgamesh wasn't so sure. They continued travelling for several more days, with Gilgamesh having similar dreams, but eventually they arrived at the Cedar Forest. When they first saw it, both men stood in awe at its lofty heights. Not only was the forest here, but also within it the mountain of cedar, which was the throne of the gods. At the majesty of the forest, and knowing that the monster Humbaba was near, a sudden terror fell upon Gilgamesh, and he became unsure of himself. He heard Humbaba in the forest, and the monster was thundering like the god of the storm. Gilgamesh's arms became stiff, and his legs began to tremor. But then Enkidu said to him, Let us go deep into the midst of the forest. Let us get going, and raise a loud cry. Gilgamesh, still uncertain, responded, Why, my friend, do we tremble like cowards, we who came across all the mountains? Then his courage grew firm, and he said to Enkidu, Take my hand, friend, and we shall go on together. Let your thoughts dwell on combat. Forget death and seek life. Drawing their weapons, the two men entered the forest. It was not long before the monster Humbaba appeared before them. He growled, saying, Let fools take counsel, Gilgamesh, with the rude and brutish. Why have you come into my presence? Then he declared, I will slit the throat and gullet of Gilgamesh. I will feed his flesh to the birds of the forest, ravening eagle and vulture. At this, the fear that Gilgamesh had felt earlier returned to him, and he wanted to flee. But Enkidu said, Do not draw back. Do not make retreat. Make your blow mighty, like that of a mountain. The two men struck at Humbaba, and the fight was quick and decisive. The sun god, Shamash, aided the warriors by rising 13 winds against Humbaba. Humbaba tried to fight, but he was overwhelmed. He pleaded to Gilgamesh, begging for his life and to be spared, saying that he would serve Gilgamesh. But Enkidu told Gilgamesh that Humbaba would be treacherous and that he should be slain here and now. At Enkidu's words, Gilgamesh drew forth a dagger from his side and stabbed Humbaba in the neck. Enkidu cut off the monster's horn to take as a trophy. Afterwards, the two men returned to Uruk in triumph. Gilgamesh washed himself and dressed in fine clothes and put the crown of the city upon himself. Now that he was dressed in his most glorious attire, the goddess Ishtar saw him and took a liking to him. She came before Gilgamesh and proposed that he become her husband. He promised him great prosperity and that he should be exalted above all other kings if he married her. However, Gilgamesh spoke to her of the misfortunes of Ishtar's past lovers, saying, "Let me tell you of your lovers, of Dumuzi, the husband of your youth. Year upon year, to lamenting you doomed him. You loved the lion, perfect in strength, but for it you dug 7 pits and 7. You loved the shepherd, the grazer, the herdsman, who gave you piles of bread, baked in embers. You struck him and turned him into a wolf. Now his own shepherd boys chase him away." Gilgamesh went on, talking of her past lovers of Ishtar and their ill fates, and firmly rejected her offer. Ishtar, at this, was filled with a murderous rage at his words. She went up to heaven, weeping, and spoke to her father Anu, the king of the gods. "O father, again and again does Gilgamesh scorn me, telling a tale of foulest slander, slander about me, and insults too." Anu was skeptical, suggesting that maybe Ishtar had provoked Gilgamesh, but Ishtar would not be dissuaded. She demanded that Anu give her the bull of heaven so she may slay Gilgamesh. Eventually Anu relented and gave in to his daughter's demands, and so Ishtar descended from heaven, taking the bull with her and leading it by the nose rope. She led the bull to Uruk, and there it stamped its foot. As it did so, a pit opened up in Uruk, and many people fell into it. The bull stamped its foot again, and a second pit opened, this time with even more falling in. The third time it stamped its foot, Enkidu fell in. But he managed to catch himself. He sprung up and seized the bull by its horns. Then he leapt across to the rear of the bull, seizing it by the tuft of its tail. Then Gilgamesh, like a butcher, moved in between the horns of the bull and thrust his knife into its neck. He held the knife firm, and the animal roared and struggled, but it fell to the ground dead. Watching from afar, Ishtar wailed, "Alas! Gilgamesh, who mocked me, has killed the bull of heaven." Whilst Ishtar mourned the bull, Enkidu was filled with rage at her actions. He cut off a chunk of the dead bull's horn and hurled it at the goddess. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh celebrated. Returning to the palace, he was filled with joy at his victory, and said to the serving girls, "Who is the finest among men? Who is the most glorious of fellows? Gilgamesh is the finest among men. Gilgamesh is the most glorious of fellows." All was well for Gilgamesh that day. However, as night fell, Enkidu had a dark dream. In the dream, the gods Anu, Enlil, and Shamash held a meeting. Having seen the men slay both monsters, they were beginning to worry about them. Anu spoke, saying, "These men slew Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, and they slew the bull of heaven. One of them must die." Shamash responded, "Was it not at your word that they slew him, the bull of heaven, and Humbaba also? Now shall innocent Enkidu die?" But Anu and Enlil would not be dissuaded that one of the two men must die. When Enkidu woke up, he came before Gilgamesh and told him of what he had seen. Enkidu despaired at the dream, and over the next few days his health began to rapidly decline. He complained to the gods and cursed the trapper and the harlot Shamat who had first brought him to civilization. But it was not to be. Then Enkidu dreamed another dark dream. In this one, he encountered a huge man. His face darkened. The man had lion paws for hands, and his claws were eagle talons. the man grabbed hold of Enkidu, and though he tried to resist, he was overwhelmed. The man began to crush Enkidu down until it was turned into a dove. Then the man brought Enkidu into the house of darkness, which none who enters ever leaves, on the path that allows for no journey back. But the residents are deprived of light, where the dust is their sustenance and clay is their food. Inside, Enkidu first stored stacks of crowns, which he realized must have belonged to kings of ages past, who had since died. Then he saw before him the queen and goddess of the underworld, Ereshkigal. She gazed upon him and asked who it was who had been brought here. When Enkidu woke from the dream, his illness had worsened. Again he told Gilgamesh of it, and the king was greatly disturbed. For the next 11 days, Enkidu became sicker and sicker. Gilgamesh stayed by his friend's side, giving him whatever comfort he could. Then, on the 12th day, Enkidu spoke weakly, saying, "My God has taken against me, my friend. I do not die like one who falls in the midst of battle. My friend, one who falls in combat makes his name. But I do not fall in combat, and shall not make my name." Soon afterwards, Enkidu's breathing fell silent, and he passed from this world. Gilgamesh mourned deeply for the loss of Enkidu. He arranged a grand funeral for the man, with a statue of Enkidu built for it. At the funeral, he spoke of the man's achievements in life. He recounted Enkidu's life with the wild animals, then their fight against Humbaba, and finally the fight against the Bull of Heaven. Gilgamesh also selected many gods from his treasury to be buried with Enkidu, so that he could take the goods with him into the netherworld. Once the funeral was complete, Gilgamesh left Uruk and began to wander the wilderness. The death of his friend had greatly disturbed him. Gilgamesh knew that one day he himself would die, and the experience with Enkidu had led him to become terrified of such a fate. Therefore, he had started to look for a way to prevent himself from dying. There was once a man known as Utnapishti who had been granted eternal life. Therefore, Gilgamesh sought this man so he could learn his secret and also become immortal. Gilgamesh travelled along the road, and by evening he arrived at a mountain pass, which was home to a group of lions. Seeing them, he grew afraid and backed away, praying to Sin, the moon god, to ensure his safety. Finding a hiding place, he slept. Then, in the night, he awoke to see the moon shining brightly overhead. Seeing this, Gilgamesh felt his courage return to him. He drew his axe and attacked the lions, slaying one and scattering the rest. In the morning, he clad himself in the lion skins and continued on his way. As he was walking, the god Shamash came before him and asked, "O Gilgamesh, why are you wandering? That life you seek, you will never find." Gilgamesh responded, "After roaming and wandering all the world, when I enter the netherworld, will rest be scarce? I shall lie there, sleeping down all the years. Let my eyes see the sun, and be sated with the light. The darkness is hidden. How much light is there left? When may the dead see the light of the sun?" Shamash left him, and he continued onwards towards Mashu's twin mountains. There was a scorpion man guarding the gates to the mountain, for within the mountains was the entrance to the sun tunnel. You see, during the night time, the sun would pass through this tunnel and go under the earth, coming out the other side to begin their next day. When Gilgamesh saw the scorpion man, at first he was afraid, but then he gathered his wits about him and approached. The scorpion man greeted him and asked why he was here. Gilgamesh explained that he was seeking Utnapishti so that he could acquire the secret to eternal life. The scorpion man warned Gilgamesh that never before had anyone travelled the path of the sun tunnel. The path was one of complete darkness, and he would only have a single day to complete it, lest the sun come up behind him and destroy him from behind as it passed through the tunnel. Gilgamesh, though, would not be swayed from his path, and so the scorpion man allowed him to go forth. He passed through the gate and entered the tunnel of the sun god. Soon he was in complete darkness. Still, he relentlessly pushed on, feeling his way through the tunnel. He could not see what lay ahead or behind. Time went on, and half a day passed with him walking through the tunnel. Getting nervous, he began to hurry. Later, he began to see the light of the approaching sun coming from behind. and he was forced to run. At the last hour, he emerged into the surface, and just ahead of the sun. He was relieved. There he saw trees with fruits growing on them. He had made it. Here, at the edge of the world, was a glorious garden. As he looked closer, he realized that they were not ordinary trees, but ones with gemstones growing on them. There were trees with lapis lazuli, ones with carnelians, and others with crystals or sea coral. Gilgamesh walked with a sense of wonder through the garden until he found the exit. Here, at the edge of the world, beyond the garden, rather surprisingly, was a tavern. The tavern belonged to a wise old goddess called Shiduri. She had watched him from a distance as he was wandering through the garden, seeing a wild-looking man, armed with weapons, approaching her home. Her initial response was to close up the gate and not let him in, but Gilgamesh called out to her, asking why she was barring the gate. She in turn asked him why he was here. Gilgamesh told her of his travels and adventures with Enkidu, and how they had slain Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, but also how Enkidu had fallen ill and died. Finally, Gilgamesh admitted his fear to her, that one day too he might die. He worried greatly about it, and begged her to show him the path to Utnapishti. Shiduri explained to Gilgamesh that his quest was futile. To get to Utnapishti, he would have to cross the ocean, but the passage was blocked due to an area midway called the Waters of Death. Gilgamesh would not be swayed though, and so Shiduri directed him to a man known as Ur-Shanabi, who worked as a boatman for Utnapishti, and said that he may be able to help. Later, Gilgamesh saw Ur-Shanabi out at sea nearby. Suddenly, Gilgamesh was overcome with a fit of rage. He charged out into the water and swung his axe down on the boat, smashing Ur-Shanabi's crew, who were made of stone, and whose bodies fell into the sea. Then, calming down almost as quickly as the rage had taken him, Gilgamesh strode back into the shore and sat down upon the bank. Ur-Shanabi came over to him and asked what in the world was wrong with him. Once more, Gilgamesh told the story of him and Enkidu, and how he was now afraid of dying. Afterwards, Gilgamesh demanded that Ur-Shanabi show him the way to find Utnapishti. Ur-Shanabi sighed and said, "Your own hands, O Gilgamesh, have hindered your crossing. You smashed the stone ones and tipped them into the sea." He told Gilgamesh to take his axe and go into the forest, and cut down 300 punting poles for the journey. Gilgamesh did as requested, and soon the ship was filled with poles, ready for the journey. Together, the two men set off across the sea. Eventually, they reached the Waters of Death. The water here was deadly to the touch. Ur-Shanabi warned Gilgamesh not to even let his hand touch the water. Instead, Gilgamesh used the punting poles to steer the ship through. Each pole could only be used once, and they burned through them fast. It was not long until they had used all the punting poles they had. Then, as a last resort, Ur-Shanabi stripped off his clothes and made a sail out of them to navigate through the seas. Eventually, after 3 days, they reached Utnapishti's island. Utnapishti saw the boat approaching and called out to them, asking who this strange man aboard was and what had happened to Ur-Shanabi's stonemen. As the ship drew near, Gilgamesh stepped off onto shore. Utnapishti asked again who he was. Therefore, one more time, Gilgamesh recounted his story about how he had travelled with Enkidu, how they had slain the Bull of Heaven and Humbaba, and how Enkidu had died, and Gilgamesh had come to realize his fear of his own mortality. He concluded by telling of his quest to find Utnapishti and demanded that he be given the secret to immortality. But Utnapishti rejected Gilgamesh's quest and told him he was fated to die, just like everyone else. Contemplating the fate of all men, he said, "Enkidu indeed they took to his doom, but you toiled away, and what did you achieve? You exhaust yourself with ceaseless toil. You fill your sinews with sorrow, bringing forward the ends of your days. Man is snapped off like a reed in the canebrake. The comely young man, the pretty young woman. All too soon in their prime, death abducts them. No one at all sees death. No one at all sees the face of death. No one at all hears the voice of death. Death so savage, who hacks men down. Ever do we build our households. Ever do we make our nests. Ever do brothers divide their inheritance. Ever do feuds arise in the land. Ever the river has risen and brought us the flood. The mayfly floating on the water. On the face of the sun its countenance gazes. Then all of a sudden, nothing is there. Gilgamesh could not accept it. He pointed out that in form and appearance, Utnapishti was like any other human. He demanded an explanation as to how Utnapishti had attained his immortality. Hundreds of years ago, when Utnapishti was a much younger man, he had lived his life in the city of Churapak, which lay on the Euphrates. At this time, the gods held a grand council and decided that they were going to unleash a great flood upon the land. However, one of the gods, known as Ea, came before Utnapishti and told him of what was coming. He said to Utnapishti, "O man of Shurapuk, son of Ubatutu, demolish this house and build a boat, abandon wealth and seek survival, spurn property, save life, take on board the boat all living things' seed." And so, following the god's instructions, Utnapishti got to work. He gathered carpenters and constructed a huge ship. Then he gathered all his gold and silver and brought it on board the ship. After this, he gathered up all the animals he could find, both wild and domestic, and brought them aboard the ship. Then he brought his family aboard, and finally, a number of experts of various skills and crafts. When the time came, Utnapishti himself entered the ship, and he sealed the hatch after him. Then the storm god came and covered the sky. A great gale was whipped up, which flattened the land. Afterwards came the deluge. A great cataclysm passed over the people, and none could escape its destruction. Such was the scale of it that even the gods themselves feared its destruction. They left the earth and ascended to heaven, seeking the safety of Anu. Many of the gods despaired of what had been unleashed upon the world. The goddess Belet Ili cried out, "It is I who give birth. These people are mine, and now like fish they fill the ocean." For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew, and the relentless downpour continued. But at last, on the 7th day, the deluge ended, and the tempest stilled, and the oceans grew calm. Utnapishti came out to see the weather had calmed, but all the people on the land that he had known had been destroyed, and he wept for the great loss. Utnapishti released the dove. It flew off, but then returned, meaning that there had been no land for it to go to. Then Utnapishti did the same with a swallow, but the same occurred, and it returned to the ship. Next he released the raven. However, this time, the raven did not return, and he knew that there was land elsewhere. Feeling relieved, Utnapishti then made an offering of incense to the gods, and with that, 3 of the gods came down to him: Belet Ili, Enlil, and Ea. At first, Enlil was angry. He had been the main god behind the deluge idea, and he had not planned on any humans surviving. Yet now there was a boat full of them. However, the other 2 gods chastised him for his behavior. They told him that if he wanted to lower the human population, why couldn't he have just sent down a plague, or unleashed some powerful lions amongst the humans, or maybe even caused a famine instead? Clearly this method of flooding the entire world had gone too far. Enlil found himself feeling guilty for what he had done, and so to make up for it, he went to Utnapishti and his wife and touched their foreheads, and as he did so, he granted eternal life unto them. Utnapishti finished recounting his story to Gilgamesh, but the man would not be dissuaded. He was determined to achieve immortality, one way or another. Therefore, Utnapishti came up with an idea. He told Gilgamesh to try and stay awake for 7 days straight. Gilgamesh tried, but unfortunately, exhausted as he was with his continuous questing, he fell asleep almost immediately. He then continued to sleep for 7 days straight. When he finally awoke, Utnapishti presented him with 7 loaves of bread, some more fresh than others, with a couple of them going stale. He told Gilgamesh that a loaf of bread had been baked each day that Gilgamesh had slept, and this was proof of how long he had slept. Seeing this, Gilgamesh despaired. "Oh, Utnapishti, what should I do? Where should I go? The thief has taken hold of my flesh. For there, in my bedchamber, death does abide, and wherever I turn, there too will be death." After this, Utnapishti told the ferryman but he must leave the island and not return. But instead he should go with Gilgamesh, back to his home city of Uruk. As the boat was departing, Utnapishtim called out to Gilgamesh and told him of a secret which he had been holding on to. There was indeed a plant which looked like a box thorn which grew at the bottom of the sea. This plant, if eaten, would restore the youth of the person who ate it. At last! There it was, the secret that Gilgamesh had sought for so long. As he and the ferryman Ushabti sailed away, Gilgamesh dived down into the waters searching for the plant, and through great luck, on one of his dives, he found it. Gilgamesh emerged from the water, clutching the plant above his head. As he boarded the boat, he was filled with delight. He had found it. He would have his immortality after all, despite what they had all told him. He said to Ushabti that he would take this plant to Uruk, and there he would eat it, and become like he had been in his youth. But alas, it was not to be so. When they reached the land, they began the long walk back to Uruk. On the way, Gilgamesh stopped to bathe in a pool of water. As he did so, a snake caught the scent of the plant. It slithered up silently behind them, and in one swift move, stole the plant and slipped away into the trees. As the snake vanished, never to be seen again, Gilgamesh wept at his loss. He knew that if he returned to the ocean, he would never be able to find the exact spot where the plant grew again. Turning to Ushabti, he cried, saying, "For whom did I toil my arms so hard? For whom ran dry the blood of my heart?" Having come so far, and having held immortality in his hands, only for it to slip from his grasp, Gilgamesh was devastated, but there was now nothing left to do but press onwards with his journey home. He and Ushabti travelled for several more days, and bit by bit they got closer to the city. Then he saw it, Uruk, the city he called home in all its majesty, the city that had made him who he was, and the place he belonged to. He felt his spirits rise to be here once more. Arriving at the city, Gilgamesh led Ushabti up onto the walls where they could overlook all of Uruk. There he said to the ferryman, "Climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth. Survey the foundation. Examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundation? A square mile is the city. A square mile the date grove. A square mile the clay pit. Half a square mile the temple of Ishtar. 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse." There, atop the walls of Uruk, Gilgamesh no longer pursued what was beyond his reach. Instead, he turned his heart towards the city that lay before him, and in doing so, began to accept his mortality.